Thank you. Well, it's very humbling to come here, and I'm an archaeologist and a geoarchaeologist and an environmental archaeologist. So I'm talking about the past. And I'm going to try and put some history into the understanding of woodlands, but also I'm actually going to deal with that through the humble snail on the basis that most of my work has been on the chalk downlands. And I've been looking at the chalk downlands, which has been full of archaeology. You only have to go to Stonehenge and Avebury and see all that rubbish that prehistoric people have left lying around. But let's try and understand the landscapes in which they inhabited, they created, and they developed, and see how that adds into the debates we have today. So I started off as a youngster digging on archaeological sites and being taught that after the glaciation, the climate warmed up and the vegetation grew. And the pollen evidence shows that all of northwest Europe was enveloped in a dense mixed oak forest which blanketed the entire area. So my role as an environmental archaeologist was to find the areas that had been hewn out of that forest and cleared for archaeology, for early Neolithic long barrows in the 37th century BC, for large enclosures in the 36th century BC. So my aim was to find this woodland and find out where people are getting rid of this dreadful woodland and removing it to create tamed landscapes in which to live. And we were given this. This was a thing which you had to learn off by rote, and you examined it. And I can see Matt Pope smiling there as he recognises this from his university days, where we were told that we had in the early Mesolithic, just after the glaciers, birch, juniper and pine woodland, and this grew into a succession of mixed oak and hazel with a bit of pine, and then ultimately into a climatic optimum, and then things happen. Then man comes in and chops it all down, clears it all, and creates a whole area for agriculture. So that is the premise that held back my research for 35 years, because that was the premise that I was based on. I wasn't bright enough to actually look at the evidence that I had right in front of me. So this is essentially the premise. We move from this woodland through to this woodland, through to this woodland, this succession, this linear succession, and then man broke that succession by removing it all. And then one of the questions we had to ask was the archaeology of the chalklands is an area which is really important. There are major archaeological sites there, so can we prove there's woodland on the chalklands? The soils are thin, they're renzinas. This can't support an ancient woodland. So perhaps the soils in the past were different. That's very true for many areas, and include the woodlands, and include the chalklands. There's no peat on the chalklands, so we can't have those long pollen sequences to inform or deceive us. And the chalky soils and the chalky sediments do not preserve pollen. So I'm stymied. However, so will we ever know, or are we just going to have to guess? Well, the answer is the humble snail. Snails, not like that one in your back garden, which is munching your plants, which are one of the biggest species. They are microscopic. There are about 118 to 124 species roaming around the landscape. And some of them like living in woodland, some like living in open country, some like living in long grassland, and some like living in short grassland. Some are only 1 millimetre or 2 millimetres in size when they're adults, which means that if you have grassland which is this tall, it's very shady and wet down here. If you have grassland which is this tall, it's quite dry, and that makes a huge difference to the snail. You all know that. You've gone up into the downlands with your partner and sat down on a nice grazed landscape. You've got a dry derriere. You go out somewhere more private and you do the same, and you'll find that your derriere is wet. The snails knew this, and therefore we have different species. We can tell the difference between long grassland and short grassland. So we do it by taking samples from archaeological sites. This is a ditch. This ditch has infilled over thousands of years. The archaeologists will tell me the date of this ditch, 3,600 BC, and this up here is medieval. So I have now got 4,500, 5,000 years of landscape history in that ditch. And here we have the late, great Professor John Evans here sampling a Neolithic ditch at Maiden Castle. So we take samples of soil, we go away to the laboratory, we boringly, tediously sieve them out, and then in the sieves, we can then identify snails down to 0.5 millimetre. Next time you've got your ruler out, have a look at 0.5 millimetre. The answer is blooming small. And then we count them, identify them, and create lots of boring diagrams. Yep, you're going to see some of those boring diagrams later. But I'll tell you how to read them. Oh, let's start off with one now. This is perhaps one of the most important sequences in southern England, where John Evans was going out to try and prove whether the chalk downlands, like the rest of northwest Europe, were blanketed in this ancient woodland. So this is a site of a Neolithic long barrow, and I'm going to be talking a lot about Neolithic long barrows because they are the first archaeological monuments in the landscape. They're not the first activity, they're the first monuments. They create deposits and soils which we can look at, which means there's a mound up here at the top. Is this right? Yes. There's a mound at the top here which preserves a soil. Under that soil, there's a tree hollow. Ooh, evidence of woodland. And under that is a late glacial involution. So we do the land snails, and the late glacial involution shows open tundra. The tree hollow shows woodland. And then we have evidence through the soil of a clearance phase, open country. And we can see this. Here is the woodland snails and shade-loving snails here. Here's the Catholic snails in the middle. Nothing to do with their religion. It's because they can't care where they live. And then there's the open country species. So we can see open country species increase, woodland decreases, archaeology clearance. Then it changes to grassland and arable, and then to dry grassland, and then we have the barrow there. So we have hundreds or thousands of years of human intervention into an area that was woodland. So, proof that there was woodland on the Chalk Downs. And therefore we can show that from sites like this in the Avebury landscape that there was woodland, and the snails are so good we can start working out that the area was cleared and the woodland wasn't very far away. And therefore we can suggest we have this constant, very heavy woodland from there. And the land snails, we've now done modern experiments looking at the distance between some of the species and the ecologies and how far the woodland is. And this is quite replicable. So we do have evidence of woodland. Therefore, it's right, the pollen analysts are right, this woodland just blanketed all of northwest Europe, including shrouding the Chalk Downlands. Fantastic. So on that basis, everything is written, and we go back to going back to these sites, looking for evidence of clearance. So we go back to a number of long barrows in Wiltshire, in Hampshire, in Wiltshire, in the Avebury landscape, and we see the bottom of it is woodland, woodland, woodland. So there we go. John Evans has now proven his argument that the downlands weren't different from anywhere else, and they contained woodland. Fantastic. We can then look at mega henges, these huge henges like Woodhenge and Durrington and potentially Avebury, and look, woodland, woodland, fine. So that's it. These snails quite clearly live in shaded environments, really quite shaded environments, and also we can distinguish those which live in woodland environments from long grassland, and then we have that there. So there we go, John's right. We can now move on. So I then came in and said, right, I'm now going to move on with this. I'm going to try and do things like mapping landscapes and looking at some of these landscapes in more detail. Rather than just proving all the chalk downlands of woodland, let's start mapping that removal of the woodland. Let's start mapping how people are managing that. So I started to work in a number of landscapes. I was very lucky. I got to work in Stonehenge and the Avebury area and Dorchester and Cranbourne Chase. And I went into the Stonehenge area and looked at 12 sites. I couldn't find any woodland. I went to the Dorchester area. We looked at 14 sites in there. That's something like 263,000 snail identifications. I can't find any woodland. Cranbourne Chase, 20 sites. This is nearly 750,000 land snail identifications. Sadly, while my wife is making dinner, I'm up in stairs under the microscope, peering down looking at the snails. I couldn't find evidence of woodland. So perhaps there's an archaeological bias. Perhaps because I'm sampling archaeological sites, by default, I'm sampling areas which have been cleared. But no, because we've looked in all of these landscapes at natural sequences of hill wash, which have fallen off the hills, infilled the valleys, and they too are coming up with the same signature. Perhaps it's an archaeological error. Perhaps it's a sampling bias or an ecological error. And this was my idea, and so for 30 years I perpetuated the idea that somewhere in the archaeological database, somewhere in my sampling, something had gone wrong. So let's have a look at those landscapes. We're going to look at these landscapes around Maiden Castle in Dorchester, Cranbourne Chase, which may be less familiar to many of you, but this is really stuffed with archaeology, Stonehenge and Avebury. And we might then just reference the South Downs of Sussex, where I come from. Is this different? Right, so we're lucky that in Dorchester, so they drove this road all the way around here. We got to see a whole number of archaeological sites. Professor John Evans, in the photograph you saw, was sampling Maiden Castle here, a big Iron Age hill fort with a Neolithic monument underneath it. And he proved that this hill contained woodland. Therefore, he proved the thesis, and therefore, when Mike Allen goes out into this landscape, of course, this was all woodland, and I can try and pair out that. However, under the rest of this landscape, I could find no evidence of any Neolithic woodland. And therefore, there's no extensive or full post-glacial woodland cover, except for one area. So in 1994, my thesis, which I had to rewrite because I suggested these areas were open and I was told it's academically unsound, so I had to unwrite that. And then in 1997, I did rather foolishly postulate, and it got into publication, though it's somewhat modified, that this area was never enveloped in post-glacial woodland. Although my archaeological peers were not very happy with that, the only area that I could prove had woodland on it was this spot here. So it looked like, I don't know whether you knew Danebury, which is a hill fort covered in woodland, and that's what Maiden Castle looked like, a hilltop with woodland, which was then cleared because the rest was relatively open. Open we don't mean as treeless, we mean as open, not covered with this forest. Cranbourne Chase, this is mad. The scale of this is 300 metres. These are all archaeological sites. Each one of these is probably a month or 2 months of analysis. We've done sequences through here from the Neolithic, the Bronze Age, right through to the Iron Age. This is the biggest piece of land snail analysis anywhere in northwest Europe. So we started again at the very first monuments, the Neolithic monuments, which must be under woodland. No, here's the land snail diagram. The land snails, they're organised by those that like living in shade and woodland. Some of these are rupestral, those that couldn't care, and those are open country. So according to the thesis, the buried soil, the soil on which prehistoric man came into to construct that monument, should be woodland. We should have evidence in this soil of woodland and clearance. Nothing. Not a sausage, not a single tree in that landscape. It's very open. Okay, so let's go to the primary ditch fills. The ditch is infill with soil and sediment, and that soil and sediment references the environment into which that ditch was dug. Okay, let's have a look at that. Oh, damn. Not a single woodland snail in there. Okay, there aren't many, but it's empty. Okay, so that barrow seems to be an open country. Essentially, I won't go through it, but essentially we looked at the Neolithic long barrow, open grassland, Dorset Cursus, we looked at 2 sections there, open grassland, White Down, Late Neolithic, open grassland. Yeah, you got the picture, okay, fine. It's all open grassland. Now, by open grassland, I'm perhaps being semantically unfair. I'm not saying it is treeless. I'm saying that the predominant area is giving sunlight and light into it so these areas can dry in the daytime and become open and have light in there. That doesn't preclude you having trees in there, doesn't preclude you having shrubs in there, but the predominant species, the predominant environment is one of nice open. And also, we can say this grassland is actually not long, ungrazed grassland, which means there are animals in there. Now, whether they're being brought in by populations to graze, or whether they're natural grazing populations, is beyond me. That's something which we need to investigate. Okay, so let's go back to the Stonehenge area, the area that all archaeologists focus around because this is meant to be the most important landscape in the country. It isn't. It's just a landscape with stuff in it. But the way to answer the question is to go to the earliest monument in that landscape, a Neolithic long barrow. So we persuade English heritage. Oh no, they've changed their name. They're now Historical England. And we asked them whether we can dig a hole in this Neolithic long barrow, which sits under a trackway. Because if I can look at the buried soil under there and work out what the soil was and the presence there, I can then work out whether this was ever woodland. So here's the barrow. It sits under a trackway, so I augured through the barrow, and even under the barrow, which you can hardly see as you walk along it, there is soil and a buried soil. So it does exist. So we dug a little hole, a weeny little hole, a metre wide, and here is that buried soil, 37th century BC. Here is the remnants of the chalk mound, which was quarried out of a ditch 3 metres deep, and here's the modern trackway. Does that soil remind you of anything? How about the soil I showed you earlier? It's a thin Renzina soil, a soil that I've argued doesn't support woodland. Professor Charlie French from Cambridge University, a soil scientist, soil microbiologist, and archaeologist came along and said, oh, it's a Renzina soil, never had woodland on it. The archaeologist in charge of the project, Professor Mike Parker-Pierce, said, oh, you're going to do any analysis? We said, well, actually, we don't actually need to do the analysis because that tells us the answers. But we did. The soil microbiology was done and the land snails were done. And yeah, you guessed it. It's open country, it isn't woodland. So these are our very first monuments in the Stonehenge landscape. So after spending 30 years trying to find the woodland and trying to find excuses of why the woodland wasn't there or why we hadn't been able to find it, the answer is it isn't there. The landscape was open. It was an open parkland landscape. And that's partly why it is so redolent in archaeology. Because the people in the past weren't daft. They weren't going to walk into a dense, dark forest and decide to cut down things to bury their dead, or then cut down huge areas of dense woodland to create huge monuments and arenas for living, for occupying, for trade, for ritual, for ceremony. They're going to move into landscapes which were rich and diverse, where there was food, where there were animals, where there was fruits, and where they didn't have to chop down everything. And if you had an open parkland, you've got all of those. So if we look back at these Neolithic long barriers, we can see that my great mentor, Professor John Evans, was slightly disingenuous with his evidence, but he even wrote in his own reports, he wanted to find woodland, and so he said woodland, and emphasised this. But actually in his own reports, he said open woodland, open woodland, open woodland. So in fact, he was actually arguing that there was an open parkland woodland, but he was a bit disingenuous because he wanted to prove there was woodland there in the first place. Now it's come full cycle. The same is true in Avebury, open woodland. So let's go back to Stonehenge. We have evidence in Stonehenge of pine. We have pine charcoal, we have pollen evidence showing pine woodland, and the land snail showing a change at exactly the same time. So we have open pine and hazel woodland in that landscape. But it's open, is the point. It has to be open for the hazel to be there and to flower. We augured the Darrington Valley. Here we are auguring, looking at the pollen, and here's the valley. And if we looked at this pollen diagram, it lacks one thing: masses of trees. Oh, even the pollen people's showing us there aren't masses of trees there. So in 1990, I created this landscape where I was trying to be very honest. I tried to say all this area that's white should be woodland, and I'm only telling you the bits that I've got data from. And therefore I said all this white bit is woodland, and then the bits where I've got here, which is open, is where I've got evidence of clearings. And so it's on the basis that I'm looking at open woodland, which I'm finding the clearances, and I'm getting them progressively bigger and bigger as time goes on. Well, it's quite clear that's just complete nonsense. And in 1997, I gave a lecture to the Royal Society or the British Academy for a book published by Professors Cunliffe and Renfrew, two leading professors in archaeology, where I mapped the landscape. Now, this is looking at the landscape and mapping it over time, looking where the grey is the heavy woodland, the dark green is dense woodland, and the light green is open grassland. When this was published, I was criticised for not having enough woodland in it. I now believe that actually the premise of having woodland and trying to rub it out has meant that that too is complete pants. And then I realised that at the time that I was starting to publish this, I read something by somebody or other who gave me this diagram here. This diagram is so important that in my latest book on monoliths in archaeology, which I talk about landscapes, perhaps one of the most important diagrams in it is published in here. If I can find the page. Is that diagram, which comes from Franz Vera's work. And now we can put the archaeology and the paleo-environment back and stop thinking about preconceptions or assumptions that are wrong and look at the data. The data was always telling us that this was open. We're always seeing this cyclical change in things. So with that, we can go back to these landscapes and look at it from an archaeological perspective. This area was open, or had open woodland. This area had open woodland. This had open parkland. Those are the 4 areas in this entire area. I have been able to identify those. So the post-glacial woodland was one of large, open, natural grassland. And the centres of it is where we see the centres of archaeology. What is interesting, and here's a dynamic that we need to discuss, is that the chalk downlands of southern England don't have that. We do have evidence of dense woodland. We do have evidence of rupestral snails. We do have evidence of deeper soils. And the archaeological signatures of the two are quite different. So the nature is defining people and people's things. But therefore the open woodland and browsing and grazing animals gave fruits and berries and nuts. In other words, meat and 2 veg. That's why the people were there. And so the whole landscape areas were selected for occupation because they were open spaces. So this is a cartoon that Professor John Evans used to tell his students and say, look, this shows how bad the general public are at actually understanding this, because this cartoonist has said that when he was a lad, all this was open fields. He said, of course it wasn't, because it was all woodland. And the irony is that cartoonist was actually perfectly right. But it doesn't mean that woodlands are somewhere that you can't avoid. And archaeologists think that if you have archaeological activity, that means the woodlands must be removed because they are dangerous or unimportant. We can build monuments in woodland. We can live in woodland, whether it's quite closed, dense woodland or open woodland. So I think it's just changed our mind of what we have to say. So I think that the past can help us inform the future. And also if we look at some of these bits of things, we can see that man has actually created many landscapes and modified them significantly. On the downlands, there are in places 3 meters of hill wash, which have washed off in 9,000 years. And we can see the pulses of those erosion coming in as a result of modification of the landscape, as a result of increased grazing. Arding the landscape, that is fantastic. You scratch the landscape and don't break the soil. The soil is an integral unit of which the building blocks of the soil are the peds, hence pedology. And then as soon as you come and plough it, you rip it up and destroy it. And then we get meters and meters of hill wash. So that's mismanaging a landscape through ploughing. And we can map that through the archaeology. So the archaeology can ironically not help us just look at the past. Hopefully it can help us manage the future. Thank you.